I really had no idea the extent that oxalates in our foods are affecting our health, and was completely clueless myself, and had many decades of serious health problems with arthritis and pain and you name it, severe fatigue. And I'm coming to a point after decades of struggle to a desperation place where I'm disabled, no longer able to work, can hardly read the mail. The endocrine doctors, after the hysterectomy, didn't know what to do with me, sent me to the sleep doctor, who says, after this fancy sleep test, that my brain is waking up 29 times every hour. So I go on this quest to solve that, which says I should solve the gut health, blah, blah, blah. And I finally land in oxalates, thanks to the Volvar Pain Foundation out of North Carolina. They've been around for 30 years now, saying that oxalates can contribute to pelvic pain and connective tissue disorders. None of that made any sense to me, because what I learned in school was oxalates cause maybe calcium deficiencies, mineral problems, and kidney stones, and nothing about pain. So I wasn't understanding it. I attempted to adjust my diet out of absolute necessity in 2009. I still didn't understand it. But now I was learning to have a lens. Like, now I was recognizing what foods were high oxalate, which foods weren't high in oxalate, thanks to the Volvar Pain Foundation's attempt to get foods tested. Because when I went to the Bible of dietitians and those of us in the field to look for answers, like, what do you eat if you need to be oxalate aware, need to be careful about oxalates, there's got to be a list in what we used to call Handbook 8. So I'm looking for the government's tables on oxalate in food. What little one is there is tiny and full of mistakes and completely inadequate. That's really the final blow on my fantasy that my education in my field of public health nutrition was actually working on our behalf to provide the information we needed to eat well. I'm not equipped as a health professional to help myself avoid oxalic acid. That makes no sense. So I have to go deeply learn myself about a subject that my whole profession seems to be ignoring. And lo and behold, as I learn this, I start to sort of hack my way into the shocking realization that 30 years of foot pain, that my foot surgery, that my sleep problem, my digestive problems, my arthritis problems, my brain fog problems, my fatigue, were all because I like to eat chard and sweet potatoes.
Gosh, that's quite a big deal.
Yeah.
So that obviously that must have I mean, anybody would want to dive into finding out why, and I can see now why you've come up with this fantastic book. Can you sort of summarize in a nutshell what exactly are oxalates or oxalic acid? Can you explain a little bit about this substance that we find in plants?
Oxalic acid is a basic chemical in nature that forms naturally. It's a 2-carbon molecule with 4 oxygens on it. Heavy oxygen on there means it's something that easily happens with oxidation. Like, you take a carbon molecule or a pair of them and you oxidize them down from, say, vitamin C. You oxidize vitamin C and you get oxalic acid. So it's easily made in nature. Plants make it. They make vitamin C first and turn that into oxalate and use it for all kinds of metabolic purposes, self-defense purposes, storage of calcium, all kinds of cool things. And it forms crystals because it bonds. It's an acid that chelates minerals, and it can have 1 or 2 negative charges and likes to attract positively charged ions, calcium and other minerals being the classic positively charged ionic materials in nature. And when there's 2 negatives on the oxalic acid and the calcium is a 2 positive ion, they like to get together. And so it's very easy to create calcium oxalate crystals. Plants do that. They build this matrix of amino acids to deliberately make shapes of various crystal shapes that they use for self-defense and storage and so on. And we are eating it in certain foods that are high in oxalate. We're eating both the oxalic acid, which is this dissolved individual tiny molecule that floats around in the water of the foods, the water of your digestive tract, and just gets into the bloodstream. And these calcium oxalate crystals built by the plants, which are severe roughage in the worst kind of way, because they're very abrasive and mechanically toxic to the digestive tract, and also probably electromagnetically toxic. But the acid itself is what's getting in. The crystals are just kind of abrading your teeth. They're harder than your teeth, so they can literally wear down teeth and potentially cause injury to the digestive tract and inflammation. In the meantime, the more inflamed your digestive tract is, the more the oxalic acid that's floating in the water gets into the bloodstream, heads straight for your vascular system, and then your liver, heart, lungs, and the body tissues. And eventually, your kidneys have to pee out the oxalic acid and crystals that form also when you're making urine. More calcium oxalate and other kinds of calcium or oxalate crystals can form as you're making urine, and that's a concentration of oxalate and potentially a clumping of the crystals into kidney stones in certain people.
Wow, gosh, well, that's a fantastic, clear explanation. Thank you for that. So we've known about, the medical profession has known about oxalates and in the form of kidney stones, as you've mentioned, and other things. It's been known about in the literature, in public health, since back in the 1930s, did you say, that far ago?
Well, we knew in the 1930s that spinach caused calcium depletion and possibly iron depletion in children. And we're already dismissing those results. But we knew much earlier than that oxalic acid is toxic and poisonous to people. We were having accidental suicides by people accidentally taking oxalic acid crystals, which looks like Epsom salts. For a stomach ailment, people would take a tablespoon or so of Epsom salts. It looks just like oxalate crystals and vice versa, and they would accidentally commit suicide. So we had an early study looking at, oh my gosh, how do we find out if this is like the new guy in Edinburgh who was this new position of forensic science, like figuring out at the morgue if someone was murdered, thought everyone was thinking this is the perfect murder weapon, because you could slip this little acidic cleaner into someone's beverages and kill them with oxalic acid poisoning. Yep. And people literally did actually use their cleaner. This isn't a cleaner. Oxalic acid powder is a cleaner to bleach leather and wood and so on, take rust out of things. And you could use it to make cheap lemonade, make it more tart. And so people were used to kind of pinching it into food to kind of cheapen the food, but you could do this on purpose and kill someone. So there was an early study published in 1823 that wanted to well, if a body showed up at the morgue, how do we tell if it was murder by oxalic acid poisoning? And that's where some of the forensic science began in the early 1800s. And we knew by the 1840s that eating rhubarb would cause this oxalic acid poisoning in certain people. And we were already measuring the oxalate crystals and oxalate in urine best we could, not necessarily quantitatively. It was difficult. But by the 1820s, it was well established that we pee out oxalate, and people were already aware that food influenced that, and there was oxalic acid in the food 200 years ago.
My goodness. So in spite of that, we've had Popeye trying to sell us spinach in the cartoons. And of course, spinach is lauded as, I've always heard it all my life, eat spinach, whether or not you like it, that's another matter. But it's always been flogged as the desirable food on your salad. This seems amazing in the light of what you're saying.
It is amazing. It's frustrating. It's disturbing in many ways. I found as I was digging around in the medical library that it would be 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, and I would feel emotionally exhausted from discovering little gems in the literature that I felt that I should have heard about before. They shouldn't have been discoveries because they've been sitting around in our knowledge base for a long time.
So let's move to what exactly can oxalates do to us? You've kind of hinted at it before, but just to sort of cover this, we know that the body forms crystals, kidney stones, and you've alluded to a few ailments that inspired your investigations. Can you just expand and maybe complete a little bit more the picture of ailments that people can be experiencing that they might be able to attribute to oxalate poisoning or oxalic acid?
Yes, so the digestive tract is often involved. So some form of leaky gut or inflamed digestion, irritable bowel syndrome, peristalsis problems, reflux, where disordered, you know, action of the whole digestive tract. You can have mouth and tooth pain, you can have salivary stones, and you can have chemical sensitivity because the liver gets flooded with oxalic acid after every meal. There's a peak at about 4 or 5 hours after a meal. So if you eat a meal like I was doing, where I would have sweet potatoes 2-3 times a day, often at dinner time with some chard on the side, and by bedtime, which is about 4 hours after dinner, I would have frank symptoms. I would have bloating and belching and hiccups. Those are all potentially neurotoxic symptoms. So it seems like digestive, but it's really the nerves are now poisoned. So it's very neurotoxic. It's interfering with the nerves' ability to manage their calcium and control their activity. They get stuck in this sort of hyperexcitability state, which causes muscle spasms and twitches and tremors. And that's what the hiccups and the belching is. You can get, trouble swallowing. You can get twittering eyelids or cheek muscles or funny body parts doing weird things. That can all be neurotoxicity. And the other side of the neurotoxicity that was very obvious in the 1820s and 30s and 40s was that you would become irritable and emotionally strange and have you'd be prone to despair, despondency, anxiety, that kind of thing. That's all the inflammation and damage in the central nervous system causing mood problems. And with the liver effects, you have chemical sensitivity potentially. You can have heart arrhythmias and so on, and funny pulsing that can be related to calcium levels in the blood that's affecting the workings of the pacemaker. You can end up with thyroid accumulations and end up with the various thyroid problems, which are really...
So forgive me for interjecting, but is it the fact that the body tries hard to, I'm just using snippets of information I've gleaned from your book. Is it because the body's trying to sort of put these oxalate crystals in places, trying to sort of tidy up, get rid of them, or whatever? Is it because it ends up putting them in so many places that we have so many symptoms effectively? So many things can go wrong because oxalate crystals get put everywhere. Is that even halfway accurate?
Well, it's part of the story where the bloodstream is able to deliver oxalic acid to any tissue. And down in the capillary beds that supply your tissues with oxygen and nutrients, there's high pressure and the oxalate gets pressed out into those tissues. And it can get picked up by the lymph glands. It can be picked up again by the veins and removed, but it does tend to get hung up in tissues anywhere. And the eyes are really common. And any place where you have lots of calcium and activity, it's really common for oxalates to get stuck, but it tends to get really hung up in tissues, not just because the body is deliberately managing this toxic stuff that shouldn't be in the bloodstream because that threatens the heart. It's trying to keep it out of the bloodstream, probably deliberately, but then there's accidental problems because certain tissues can't defend themselves from the oxalic acid. A healthy cell tries to rebuff the oxalic acid and not be affected by, or at least not have it stick or get into it. But any cell that's undergoing inflammation or injury, especially if there's cell debris hanging around, the little bits of cell debris, the vacuoles and the cell membrane fragments that happen after a cell dies, or you wear it out, or you injure yourself, you work hard at sports after work, or you had surgery or cut yourself. Those are areas the tissues can't defend themselves, and that extra junk hanging around those vascular bits cause what we call precipitation. So the acid starts going into crystallization processes and becomes these little nodules, these little nano seed crystals that can grow. And they'll grow more in those areas where there isn't a lot of good self-defense going on, where there's just, problems. And the immune system comes in and tries to contain it and contain the crystals so they don't continue to cause electromagnetic problems that harm local cells and harm the nerves. So there's that accumulation process, which some of it's active and some of it's passive. It has to be active because the body's managing how much oxalate ends up in the kidneys, how much oxalate's in the bloodstream, because either one is really dangerous to the whole body. But you also just have these other effects on cells generally, where they're not getting enough calcium they need. They're getting electromagnetic stress, they're having oxidative stress. It's affecting the mitochondrial function. The cells slow down in their ability to produce ATP energy, and they start just having, just the normal cells start having trouble. And this can be affecting the cells that line your capillaries, the cells of your heart, the cells anywhere. And so over time, depending on which tissues are being most affected, which is really idiosyncratic and different in every person. Yeah. So you're down here at the fundamental level of cell functioning and oxidative stress and excessive inflammation, and how that shows up in any individual person and where and what tissues, why, when, is sort of mysterious.
Yeah, so that's amazing. It sounds like an incredibly harmful substance that's wreaking all sorts of damage in the human body. It seems amazing we're all still walking around in some respects.
We are amazing. We are, our life force is very strong, and it's working on our behalf at all times and allowing us to be silly and think spinach is healthy and overdo it and seemingly get away with it, which helps oxalate be the sneaky criminal. It's like a really good murder mystery where the least suspected suspect is really the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned that it binds with calcium. I think, was it in your book that it possibly binds with magnesium as well? Can this be a cause of various nutritional deficiencies for some people? I guess everybody's different, but can oxalate be the culprit?
Absolutely. I think it's a major culprit in causing a generalized inadequacy in mineral nutrition, which is being exacerbated now because we don't drink mineral-rich water like we once did when we were drinking from streams and springs that have a lot of rocks and minerals in them. We use sort of recycled water and filtered water, which are fine in some aspects, but lower in minerals. So we also have a food supply that's lower in minerals, and we tend to eat highly refined stuff and things like sugar that don't have minerals. And so we're relying on fortification, which is mostly being done with just iron and some crummy stuff. So the oxalates are being facilitated by the other things in our diet and environment that are making us even more prone to nutrient deficiencies, which is shocking to the modern mind, because those of us in public health and medicine think we've protected the public from deficiencies. We've fortified the food. We've made vitamins available. We have calcium added to the orange juice. Like, aren't we working on this? But it isn't working.
Yeah, it's not really addressing the root cause, is it? Sally, maybe we could move to some of the worst offending food types so that people can sort of concretize what they're supposed to be avoiding. Maybe you could just walk us through, and I'll just, chip in with questions as we go, as to what are the main food offenders. We've already mentioned, I think, chard, spinach, and beet greens. I think we talked about those three, but
those are the three greens. That's good. Yep.
What else do we have to be aware of?
Those are the ones we most trust, and they're really off the charts high in oxalate. And the more you juice them, the more you liberate that oxalic acid in a watery environment, and more of it gets absorbed. So the current trend of juicing them, in the old days, you would cook it with cream and so on, and eat it with a whole meal that usually had some dairy in it or something. But now we're really making those particularly bad and using a lot and using them frequently and getting them year round. So they're a big problem because they're trusted. And then the nuts are now of great interest to everyone, and almonds and cashews and peanuts seem to be everywhere. And there's a lot more permission now to eat them because public health has backed off on don't eat nuts because they're high in fat. Now it's like, eat nuts because they have the healthy fat, which I would argue isn't true. But they're very toxic and high in oxalate, especially the almonds, cashews, and peanuts. The seeds, like the hemp seeds, the chia seeds, sesame seeds, they're a problem. And they're also considered so fabulous.
Yeah, and you mentioned rhubarb there earlier as well. I mean, that's sort of probably out on its own. Over here in England, it has a tradition, rhubarb and apple crumble. I won't be eating any more rhubarb, I can assure you. But also...
That's interesting that you guys combine rhubarb and apples, which are totally different times of the year. Rhubarb is a spring thing.
I'm sorry. Yeah. I mean, we don't combine them, but
Oh,
we have rhubarb crumble at that time.
Yeah. So I grew up on both those things. My German mother made apple, we call it crisp here, and rhubarb crisp, and loved it. My sister and I played with the rhubarb behind the house. We both ended up dyslexic in school, and probably because of our rhubarb. The rhubarb was the thing that turned on the scientists in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s to the fact that there's this oxalate overload poisoning problem from foods because it's seasonal, and it would be the fancy people who could afford it would seasonally get sick on it when, maybe the bachelor went to the bakery too much in the day. The bachelor doctor, because a lot of the people who were getting sick on the rhubarb poisoning were doctors, and they were friends of the doctors. That's how they were able to verify the symptoms and see the guy's personality change and all these things that were occurring because they were all friends. So the other foods, like nowadays, people are very concerned about digestion and gluten, and they go on gluten-free diets or paleo diets, which is gluten-free. And they're substituting, instead of wheat, like I did that when I stopped being a vegan. I stopped eating my beans and my wheat because they were clearly bothering me, and I added sweet potatoes in. Well, nowadays what people like to do is they add almond flour, quinoa, teff, buckwheat, because these are gluten-free pseudo grains for the grain-free, gluten-free diet, and they're way worse than wheat was for oxalate content. And you go on to dairy-free at the same time to save your gut and be paleo. And so you go on these, health quests, and you end up adding in these high oxalate foods. And then there's turmeric. It's going to make you great. Well, that's really high in oxalate, the whole root turmeric, not the curcumin extract. And then some of the other spices, black pepper and cumin, and then kiwi, star fruit, blackberries. These are awesome.
I've heard, I think you mentioned in your book as well, raspberries, which I found particularly devastating because I was eating a lot of raspberries until I read your book, in early February. So thank you for that. But
I'm sorry for the trauma.
No, it's good. I'm all for knowledge for prevention, and I think my audience is too. And I know other people have spoken on podcasts. When people sort of knock coffee. I mean, I'm a great coffee drinker, although my habit has taken another blow in of course, realizing that it's a legume, it's a bean. I believe that the heating process with a lot of these legumes and beans can actually go some way to neutralizing. Is it the lectins it neutralizes? Maybe not so much the oxalates. But these foods are still bad for us, and ultimately, I'm all for finding out what's bad for me, and then at least we have the choice to avoid it. So coffee's in there as well, isn't it? Chocolate, is that right? The chocolate.
Well, coffee's not really high in oxalate, interestingly. Okay. I think if it were, I think someone would have already knocked me out because the people love their coffee. But you're so right about our daily habits really start adding up over the years. So something like coffee, people should make a considered choice about whether it's really worth it or not. And yes, soaking bean substances for several days and in high heat, processing them reduces the lectins, which is a giant protein. But oxalate doesn't get disarmed by soaking or the heat, and it's a completely different molecule that luckily is not in coffee, not to any extent. But chocolate, the darker the chocolate, that's where the oxalate is. Oxalate is being an ion charged molecule. It has a polarity to it. If you remember your chemistry, water is a polar molecule. Therefore, ions and things like oxalate are water soluble, which means that when you separate out the fat from something, the fat doesn't have the oxalate. So the cocoa butter doesn't have the oxalate. It's the dark fraction that you use to make the chocolate dark. So when you use cocoa powder, you're using the pure oxalate. And use cocoa butter, there's no oxalate there. Same with peanut oil and other fatty substances extracted from high oxalate foods. Your lotions and things that have almond oil in them, that's all low oxalate. So it's a little tricky. I'm coming out with the data product to help clarify that, but you don't need that. The lists in the book, and hopefully if you carefully read, you probably have to reread the book because there's all these little tiny info gems jammed into short sentences all through the book, and you can't possibly absorb it all, and you can never remember it because the wider culture doesn't affirm this knowledge. It's just absent, so absent that we're being taught quite the opposite. And so you need to keep finding some way to let this soak in, which is, I guess, why people keep listening to these podcasts. They want to keep having it like soak in.
It's very useful, isn't it, to hear things two or three times, I find.
Or 100 times.
Yeah.
I really had a hard time myself, like remembering what to eat in the beginning. I remember we went to visit beautiful gardens, one of the nicest gardens on the East Coast of the States, for Thanksgiving weekend with friends. And we got nice hot food from their cafeteria. And I got this meal, and I was sitting there wondering, do I eat the carrots or don't I eat the carrots? I don't know. So I asked my friend next to me, I said, would you eat my carrots? I just didn't know. And I find with the whole food thing, going back and checking and rechecking, because we misremember things. Yes. And so even though you knew it once, the way you're remembering it isn't right. So it's okay to keep being repetitive on learning how to be oxalate aware and learning what it means to become oxalate aware, what it might mean for your health journey, because the getting out of oxalate poisoning can be a bit of a bumpy ride too.
Yes, we'll get on to that one. I just wanted to ask you, so cooking doesn't really do much to oxalates, you've mentioned. What about fermentation, another sort of historic treatment of vegetables to render them more, or render them less poisonous, I suppose you could say, more edible? Does that have an effect?
Less poisonous, both, because the fermentation is having the bacteria do some of the pre-digesting for us, and actually sometimes improving the nutrient quality of something by producing a few B vitamins or something. So fermentation is an interesting thing. There's several reasons why it's not that valuable in the context of thinking about oxalate. One is you cannot eat large piles of fermented foods, because that becomes stressful, and that actually creates more oxalate in the body. If you overeat fermented foods, then oxalate forms in the body because of the stress of that, probably the stress of turning up inflammation in order to cut back all those excessive bacteria that's in fermented food. So I don't know if they've tried, like, well, what if I cook my fermented food? So you can ferment your cabbage into sauerkraut and then cook it, which is sometimes done in German cooking, where you make sauerkraut a whole side dish, but they cook it first. So there's a lot that way, but also fermentation, when you ferment cabbage, it was already a low oxalate vegetable to begin with. So it's not really improving the oxalate so much. And when you ferment something that's very high in oxalate, like poi in the Pacific Islands, particularly Hawaii, they use poi as a traditional food. This is a taro root, high in oxalate, and they ferment it, and it reduces the oxalate by 20%.
Okay.
20% of a really high oxalate food is nothing.
No, it's still a high oxalate food. Yeah.
But does that make sense? Like, a lot of foods are either super high or don't have much, and mostly it doesn't make a difference either way, because it's either still too much or it was already low enough to be safe.
Gotcha. Okay. So I suppose it's important for us to remember, why are these oxalates there? And you mentioned in the book that plants don't want to be eaten, basically, do they? They put out these defensive chemicals, for a variety of reasons, but I mean, especially with the nuts and so forth. I believe that the oxalates are designed to almost render the nuts, the tree seeds, as indigestible. Is that right?
Yes, and there's other corollaries to that, like phytic acid, and these other things help to keep the seed dormant and protected. And the oxalate crystals are often put in the bran layer and the outer layers of that little seed. And that gives a hardness to the seed and an indigestibility and kind of shield of protecting it from the acids of digestion and so on, and even the mechanical process of digestion. So yeah, I mean, seeds are brilliantly designed. Plants are smarter than we are, I've decided. And they figured out how to trick us into wanting their fruits and seeds and helping to distribute the fruits and seeds in nature without really feeding us at much at all. We're supposed to just kind of release it at the end of our interest in it as a fecal matter and well fertilized somewhere. And if you
how does that work? Forgive me for interjecting, but some plants want us to eat their fruit, don't they, to help distribute the seed? So how does that tie in? Because some fruits, like star fruit, as you mentioned in your book, and kiwis, as you mentioned already here, raspberries, They are very, very high in oxalates, and yet they the plants are effectively using animals to distribute their seeds.
Yeah, it's a brilliant strategy. You live long enough to poop it out, but then you may not remember where you got it because you're so neurotoxic, like you're kind of in a daze or too discouraged or despairing to come back to the tree and hurt the tree anymore. And yeah, so it's not just us, it's the birds and the other critters who take an interest in the fruits and seeds for food, that they're encouraged to move things around in nature. I mean, the squirrels are so good at burying seeds, and they're imagining it's going to be food for them, but then they forget where they buried it, and because they're not real smart. And so the tree effectively is using the squirrels and the birds and the humans to help them conquer the world.
So is there a test for high oxalates in the blood? Can I go down to my doctor and book an appointment, get a blood test, and find out where I'm at on the oxalate scale? Is that possible?
From blood? Absolutely not. You could be dying of oxalate poisoning and have zero oxalate in your blood. The body is smart enough to not leave oxalic acid, a chelator of calcium and other minerals, and a destroyer of immune cells and a destroyer of red blood cells in the blood. So that's the last place you're going to find oxalates in blood testing. So when you do see it, it's a lucky moment. It's not telling you the situation in the whole body. The tissues, the whole system is an intelligent organism that's doing lots of intelligent things that haven't been studied. So we haven't been curious enough about all of this to figure out if there's any way to predict this. Now, there are researchers who are talking about biomarkers of other things we might measure to look at whether oxalate's accumulating in the bones, whether the bone activity is occurring in response to crystal deposits there, and so on. But it's very unreliable. You're going to get false negatives that make you think, oh, no oxalate problem. And that's the wrong thing to think, because modern people grow up. And the other thing we didn't mention for high oxalate foods is potatoes and sweet potatoes. And we grow up
potatoes, yes,
potatoes every day, right?
Again, I'm amazed with how prevalent potatoes are. Fried in unhealthy vegetable oils, almost every meal for many people. How the human race is still standing upright. Well,
we're not very upright. If we have mood problems. We have a drug problem in the United States. People are so despairing. They're using all kinds of medications, street drugs, and so on. We have an overdose problem. We have a prescription drug addiction problem. We have children with mood problems and focus problems. It
seems that all the problems are sort of chronic and sort of they sort of slip past us, don't they? There's nothing that smacks you in the face after you've eaten some potato chips or a hamburger with French fries or something. There's nothing that says, I shouldn't have done that. Right.
It's a very subtle slap, and sometimes zero symptoms at all for a long time. Even people who are now releasing oxalates. You spoke to someone recently, after 7 years of eating no oxalate before he's now seeing some illness symptoms from the oxalate coming back out of his bones and tissues. It took a long time. So yeah, you can't always go by symptoms, but generally the more we've put a 24-hour grocery store out there and all this shipping of fresh foods all over the place, the more we've encouraged people to eat produce and plant foods, the sicker we are. It hasn't had a real impact. That 5 a day or millions of vegetables a day you're supposed to have now hasn't made a big impact in obesity, diabetes, mood, functioning, performance in school, age of first injury, age of first bone break, like all the things that really causing problems aren't getting better.
No. So there's no test. So really, it's a question of observing any health issues that you have, isn't it? Any symptoms, and working from there. And of course, a preemptive approach by reading your extremely useful book. So maybe we can move on to then. We just touched on it, but I was not depressed, but I was sort of knocked back slightly to read in your book as I progressed through, to find that simply abruptly saying, okay, well, I won't eat all that lot then, and I'll be okay, isn't the end of the story, is it? Because of, as you explain in your book, the nature of the way oxalates have been stored everywhere, in every cupboard and under every bit of carpet, metaphorically speaking, in the body, that there's now this massive housekeeping job to get rid of the stuff. and then you can have your problems start, which seems a bit of a sort of poke in the eye to somebody that's, you know, set out on the right path at least. But can you sort of describe why you have to be cautious with, you know, stopping eating oxalates? What are the processes going on, and you know, in a brief sense, you know, what's the best way to deal with it?
Right. So it's not the case for everyone. Some people can go to oxalate aware eating and go down to really low oxalate consumption and do pretty well with just here and there symptoms that don't really interrupt them. And some people have much more dramatic responses to this. And we don't know how to separate one from the next. So it's important that everyone be aware that you're signaling the body some important information that's no longer what I call summertime when we're eating potatoes and berries and high oxalate foods. It's what I call the winter time, where we tend to eat more non-plant foods over the winter, the caribou and the fish and so on. And the body is aware of seasonality and aware of these changes, and is constantly tasting or reading what's going on chemically, what's coming into the body, how it has to deal with it. So it's been with the potatoes every day, you know, tea 3 times a day, potatoes twice a day, chocolate once a day. You know, we've been eating like this since we were 1. People start giving us sweet potatoes and spinach before we're 1. They give us a chocolate cake when we turn 1. And there we go, off to the races, where we have almost daily exposure, which keeps the body in this defensive summertime sequestration. I've got to hold it, got to stash it, got to hide it. And now you're like, oh, it stops coming in. The body's been waiting for this moment for a long time. Yay, we can get rid of this nasty stuff. And some bodies are really excited about that moment, and they just start clearing out a mess and dumping it back into the bloodstream, which is give you palpitations, heart arrhythmias, high pulse. You can end up in the emergency room with thinking you're having a stroke. It can assemble too much into the kidneys and cause kidney stones in those people who are prone to that. It can increase your irritable bladder. Sometimes all that stuff gets better, and sometimes it gets worse. All kinds of weird stuff can happen. These skin rashes can break out into sudden hives or itchiness. You can break out in little boils. And some people, literally, the small percentage of people, start pushing oxalate crystals out of their skin in various forms. Sometimes it's a fine white dust. Other times it's actual grit that you can literally see with the naked eye. Stuff coming out of the eyes. The tartar starts forming on the teeth. You start getting headaches, ear ringing, all kinds of neurological symptoms. So there's funny things that can happen. And if it's too much at once, it's just so toxic, because it's not just the oxalic acid repoisoning you at a high level, but it's also involving inflammation, because it's your immune cells that are going after it. And what's telling the immune cells to go there and deal with it is cytokines and pro-inflammatory. So you can get systemic inflammation going up, which adds to this kind of bloated, yucky, fatigued, I can't sleep, grumpy feeling of the poisoning.
Right. So, I mean, you mentioned earlier, of course, how it mustn't be in the blood, the oxalates, and that's, you know, the worst place. But it seems like there's a tricky situation. It's stashed everywhere. I imagine for it to get out of the body, you know, at least through by the urine, it would have to go through the blood. Obviously, you know, you mentioned going out through skin and things like that. So you're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place, aren't you? You can't get the stuff back into the bloodstream to shift it without it causing all the symptoms again. Is that right?
That's right. That's why prevention is so better.
Yeah, prevention. Let's go for that. So let's just discuss very briefly the amounts of oxalates we're eating, and what sort of numbers should people be aiming for? How do we measure it in milligrams per serving, I believe, from your book. So maybe we can try to give people a flavor of how many milligrams, or what sort of limits they should be aiming for in a day if they're going to read your book, work out how much oxalates are in this food, that food, and actually sort of obviously your book goes into the whole process of weaning yourself off anyway. But to give people a flavor of the numbers, can you help us with that?
Yeah, for proportion's sake, that's where numbers really help us, to kind of get a sense of proportion. And your body is designed to handle about 100 to 200 milligrams a day. One spinach salad is about 450 milligrams. And, let's see, 1.5 ounces, which is 50 grams of chocolate could get you into like 60 or 70 milligrams already. That's halfway to your daily tolerance for oxalate. So it doesn't take a whole lot in modern times with
Yeah.
spinach, chocolate, almonds to be as much as 1,000 milligrams or more, which might be, 8 times what you're built to handle. And so
Okay,
you
so
want to
so so
bring
sorry to just to rewind a little bit. Your body can handle what, about 150 milligrams ingested per day? Would that be about right?
that's the general feeling of the massive amount of kidney research that's been going on for 75 years. The NIH here in the US has been funding all oxalate research. It's been going to kidney researchers who's been looking at urinary tolerance, the kidney tolerance, the kidney's ability to handle and effectively clear the blood is somewhere around 100 to 200 milligrams a day. That's for healthy people who have great kidneys and good guts and aren't hyperabsorbing the oxalate. So that's
Right.
based on an assumption of 10% absorption. 10% absorption of 100 milligrams gives you 10 milligrams in the urine if it were all going straight away to the urine. But when you're eating a lot, it can't all go straight away because it's just too much for the kidneys. So yeah, it's really easy every meal to surpass. I mean, 150, if you're on a 3 meal a day pattern, 150 means 50 milligrams per meal.
Yeah.
And a low oxalate diet is defined as under 60 milligrams a meal. So a low oxalate diet would be a third of the amount that was considered doable for a healthy person.
Okay, so if you were to eat some quinoa and maybe some sweet potatoes and have a spinach and almond milk smoothie in the morning, you could be really seriously over peaking your oxalate intake, couldn't you, and stressing your body out.
Very easily. The spinach smoothie is somewhere between 700 and 1,200 milligrams of oxalate, depending on how big it is, how much spinach, how much almond butter is in there, how much peanut butter, how much turmeric, all these ways of like gilding the lily in terms of escalating that oxalate content in the smoothie. And then,
Yeah.
if you're not a smoothie person, what if you just had whole wheat toast with peanut butter in the morning? Well, those are high oxalate foods. And then you could have a little pizza with spinach on it or a little cheap Subway sandwich. In order to make that cheap Subway sandwich healthy, you might ask for the spinach instead of the lettuce on it. There's little ways. Oh, a little peanut snack, a little peanut M&Ms, a little chocolate bar at the end of the day. Then you come home to when in every meal you get offered either French fries, mashed potatoes, baked potatoes, tater tots in school. I don't know if you have them over there, but they have been giving tater tots at school since I was a kid,
Yeah.
which is a long, 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 long time ago.
Yeah. No, it's easy to see how one's you could get overloaded in our ignorance, and it just seems shocking to me that this isn't mainstream news, and that the medical fraternity can remain silent about this. So you can process a certain very small number, so it's not all doom and gloom. I believe that oxalates are actually endogenously produced, aren't they, to some small degree? How much oxalate does the body produce?
The body produces 10 or 12 milligrams a day, most of which is coming from vitamin C degradation. So if you eat a lot of high vitamin C foods, or especially if you eat supplements or supplemented foods that have vitamin C in it, a great proportion, easily half or more of the oxalate endogenously produced is coming from an exogenous compound called vitamin C. So that's a little bit tricky. They keep calling that endogenous production, but in fact, it's because of the way we eat and use supplements that great much of that endogenous production is occurring. The real true endogenous production is this little tiny fragment that comes from the breakdown of connective tissues. That's hydroxyproline and amino acid, probably glycine, maybe one other, but these amino acids that make up connective tissue, as regenerating better tissue or wearing yourself out on your, softball game or whatever, you're generating a certain amount of oxalate there, but it's a tiny little sliver. That's one reason the body knows about oxalate, knows how to handle it. It's a known, what we call uremic toxin that the kidneys are designed to handle. Surprisingly, the kidneys can handle way, way more than that. It's shocking how much we can handle. And I think, it's remarkable. Nature never assumed we could bypass this capacity because the capacity is so beyond what the endogenous production is. So we've been given a lot of leeway by our biology to be kind of fragrant, I can't speak today, but be kind of casual in these paying attention to these toxins. We get away with it because we have some reserve capacity that we wear out and wear out and wear out with time. And the older that you get, the more likely you have urination problems, nighttime urination, urinary frequency, leaking urine, prostate swelling, kidney stones, and eventually kidney disorders. That they are blaming, diabetes for all the kidney disorders, which is not unreasonable. Of course, what's causing metabolic problems but toxicity and deficiency disorders? Yep. And could the healthy foods be promoting this underlying metabolic stress that's making us more likely to have diabetes and weight problems and so on?
I was surprised also to hear that collagen, again, I don't know if it contains that amino acid you just mentioned in the connective tissue. But it does. Okay. Obviously a warning there for people not to guzzle too much collagen, because that's another very fashionable health fad.
Very much so. Really crazy popular. So the summary of this endogenous production is the three or four things that you can control in terms of affecting how much oxalate you produce endogenously in the liver is don't overdo the vitamin C, don't supplement a lot of collagen, and don't overdo the fermented foods. Those are all precursors for endogenous production, as is thiamine deficiency, exposure to pollution, drinking of ethylene glycol, and generally being inflamed and poisoned is going to increase liver stress. And the more liver stress and inflammation, the more of this endogenous production.
Yeah. So I'm aware of time, so let's see if we can wind it up now. In terms of getting off oxalates, do you mentioned in the book, and I totally recommend anybody getting the book. If you're serious about preventing ill health, then this book is absolutely essential. So I really would recommend getting it. But in terms of coming off our oxalate foods, when you suddenly realize, my goodness, all these aspects of my diet, I need to, do you think it can be as simple as, sort of taking them out one by one? Because in your book, you make it clear that it's best not to just suddenly stop for reasons we've discussed. Is that the best approach, to just sort of take something out and then another thing and just sort of try and wind it down and aim for, as you said, 50 to 100 milligrams per day?
That's the perfect approach, is take it easy. Don't feel like you have to take on this giant confusing project. You don't have to know everything all at once. Just look at a food like me with chard. I can live without chard, even though I've liked it since I was a kid. It's no trauma to live without chard. So, and you've got foods like that you're eating. You're like, yeah, I could live without them. Start with the ones that you can live without and just learn a substitute, or, increase a little bit of cheese or eggs or something in your diet so that you're getting enough calories. And most of these vegetables offer you like 20 calories. So you're not missing much if you leave out the chard or the celery or whatever from your recipe, because it wasn't actually giving you anything in terms of really keeping you going through the day.
One last question. Do you find yourself, given the knowledge you've acquired and all the research you've done, do you find yourself suspicious of the pro-vegetarian lobby these days? Or do you think it's simply a case of tiptoeing carefully through the plant kingdom, as it were, and choosing what we eat and what we don't?
Well, depending on your particular health situation, this is where it needs to be highly customized, your approach, because anyone can lower gout and arthritis and pain syndromes by avoiding the high oxalate foods. You can maintain a vegan diet and feel better. I've seen this happen over and over again, but you won't necessarily build the health that you deserve. You deserve to not have broken bones and not be anxious and depressed, to be able to build muscles, to be able to run, jump, and play through your full life. That would be nice. And I don't think a vegan diet permits that. But if you just start not being so poisoned, it makes you stronger constitutionally to start expanding into a more varied diet. And so that would be great. But it doesn't matter what kind of diet you adhere to now. You can always weed out these high oxalate foods and maintain your membership in whatever nutrition club you want to be in for the moment. Hopefully, this will help bust people out of this clubbish, cultish thinking around food and get away from the toxic diet culture where we have to sign up for a certain name and start calling ourselves by the name of our diet, as if that's our identity. And I would really like to free people up from that tyranny and just start teaching people, listen to your body, respect your body, start loving yourself enough to know that you deserve the better health that you can build for yourself if you're willing to kind of break out of conventional thinking and break out of the little chambers we put ourselves in.
Yeah, well, wonderful. Thank you for that. And I'm a big fan of preemptive approach of try and learn from other people's mistakes so you don't have to make them. You know. So Sally, thank you so much for writing this book, because I believe it's the first one of its kind. I know there's sort of literature that people can dig into, you know, from way back and all that, but not very accessible to most. So thank you so much for making this book, Toxic Superfoods, making you know, how oxalates are making us sick. It's a real fantastic thing. Is there anything you'd like to say to promote any, you know, your website or anything around your book? Obviously, we're promoting your book here, but is there anything you wanted to say by way of closing?
Well, I would like to say thank you for helping make a lifetime dream come true. As a 12-year-old, I decided I would commit myself to helping people not be sick, like teaching them prevention through how to eat. And I've never known how to do that until I did this research and figured out how to try to teach this topic and come up with this book. And by picking up the book and reading the book and sharing it with your listeners, you are fulfilling a lifetime dream for me.
Brilliant.
I love you for that. And I love everyone who's taking the book and taking time, devoting their precious time to learning this subject. I devoted way too much precious time to this subject because I have this feeling of integrity about what I've always been up to, and I'm finally getting a chance to do that. And without your help, I can't do that. So I'm so grateful for these connections that we're building as a community. And I just cannot begin to tell you how important it is that we have this conversation. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, please read my book. You can order it anywhere. Bother all your local retailers about carrying the book, please. You can come to my group meetings if you want. I do small group meetings and teach this with visual aids and so on, and you can meet other people. And I'll be coming out with a data product soon on my website. If you need a cookbook, there are grams. It's all written in American measures, but I try to provide gram amounts and so on to make the cookbook usable by all. It's just a PDF on my website. Eventually, I'm going to be able to, I've found a printer now. We might be able to make it print available. So if you want to say,
whereabouts are you, Sally? You mentioned you have these discussion groups, just so that people know what region.
So you go to SallyKNorton.com and you can sign up through Zoom. And I do different times because we have some real big fans in Australia, people in Europe, people in the Western US. And so we have like lots of time zones to cover. But I'm in the eastern part of the Atlantic states of Virginia in the US. And that's, you know, home of the original British invasion right here in Virginia. And I was part of that invasion up in the Boston area in 35 or something from England. So yeah, I'm still here on the East Coast, been here for like 400 years.
Well, look, Sally, thank you so much. Once again, I really appreciate your time and your the many years of work you've clearly put into this fabulous book. And I know lots of people are going to get a great deal from it. One of the themes of this podcast is you know, planning ahead so that we don't fall into the traps of ill health. You know, it's all about trying to prevent ill health and create good health. So thank you very much, you know, for helping us do that. And thank you all for listening. Do visit website, lawfulrebel.com. There's loads more there on how to be healthy, how to find truth in an age of increasing deception. And most of all, please join me another time for an episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.